Hey everybody, welcome back to Practical CSS Grid. I hope you enjoyed exercise 4. I hope you took some time after the exercise to actually play with the way those banners can be art directed. And I hope you also maybe went out on the internet, found yourself a new banner image and played around with how you might art direct one in the future. Or maybe paired yourself with a designer and saw really what you can do with CSS Grid for banner images. Next up, in exercise 5, we're going to be taking a look at 2 new properties in CSS that are really powerful for enacting big changes in our layouts depending on various things. So in this case, we're going to be doing big changes responsively at various breakpoints. But as you can see, we're going to take basically 2 different design patterns and pair them together and write as little CSS as possible to go between those. And the 2 properties we're going to be using are going to be named grid lines, and we're going to be using grid template areas. So let's go ahead and dig in and take a look at what this looks like in production. So you can see here we have our finish.html document, and in this document we have 2 promotional areas. We're using that whole even odd image left right kind of idea. We have a headline, a little bit of description text, and a button with an image kind of quote unquote floated next to it, right? Positioned next to it in our layout. And then the second one is going to be on the left hand side for the image, the right hand side for our text. And then if we had more and more going down the page, they would just pick up and alternate left and right. The cool thing about this is we're going to take it and we're going to actually use those foreground images at tablet and at mobile to become background images for a different type of promotional space. In this case, we've got 2 promotional spaces next to each other, big background image, text on top, and then when we go down to mobile, you can see they stack on top of each other. The great thing about how we're going to be doing things in this exercise is it's going to be 100% mobile first, markup first, and we're going to be able to do a whole lot of work just in the styles to enact new layouts. No markup changes necessary. So let's go ahead and switch over to our starting position here. And as you can see, we've got 2 promotional spaces and they are full width. They're still going to be display block like we started all the other ones so far. And they've got big, bold background images. And we're going to start by building these for mobile. We're going to be doing mobile first development with this. Let's switch over to our code. And as you can see, we just have the bare minimum markup to make this work. We have a containing section for our 2 promos. We're calling that promos. And we've got 2 class promo divs inside of that. And then inside of each of those promos, we have a headline, text, a button, and an image. Now, the great thing about what we're going to be doing here is that actually wherever makes the most sense from a markup perspective for that image to be, from markup first, accessibility first perspective, you can actually put that, and we're going to change how it's ordered in our styles. So let's go ahead and dig into the styles a little bit. We have a few additional style elements here just to make things look a little nicer. We got button color. One important note is we do have on all of our images a max width of 100%. That's going to make sure that they size down to their container as opposed to trying to break outside of it like an image would do and maintain its aspect ratio. But other than that, all the other stuff in here is just going to be for a little bit of additional styles to make things pretty. So first and foremost, we're going to come in and give ourselves a little bit of room to work. And I'm going to go ahead and define out our promo class. We're going to start by creating a grid inside of promo as opposed to going fully into that promos area. Because remember, we're starting with the mobile view, which just had those stacked promos instead of side by side. So in this case, like we've done in every other exercise so far, we're going to define it by display::grid. And that's going to actually define our context. And then we're going to give our grid columns and rows. You might think we might not need columns yet, but I'm going to show you a little bit later on how this is going to make things a little bit more flexible. So let's go ahead and define those as grid template columns. And in this case, we just have one FR, and that's just going to be the 1 column. And then we're going to define grid template rows because we actually want our content to go inside of multiple rows of a grid. So this is actually going to define our white space inside of our promo as well as where that content's going to go. So I'm going to define 10VH, and that's going to actually be the top margin. So we're actually defining a row specifically for margin in this case. And then I'm going to use 3 keywords to create 3 spots for our headline, text, and button. And I'm going to use the keyword auto, which is just going to automatically space it depending on the content of the grid. And then I'm going to finish it with a 5th grid row, and that's going to be another 10 VH. And that's again going to allow for a bottom margin of 10 VH. You can have any kind of value you want there. You can make it pixel, rem, em, that sort of thing. In my case, I want these to be a little bit taller, and I want them to size based on the size of our device. So if we go back over to our code, or to our browser, you can see not a whole lot has changed, except for we've got a little bit of extra space at the top and bottom of these. Again, those 10 VHs in place. I'm actually going to go ahead and open up our developer tool so we can take a look at how that grid is defined. And let's size this back down. And I'm going to go in, I'm going to say, all right, div promo grid. And I need to define a color on this, red, there we go. So now you can kind of see that the promo space headline is actually a little bit too tall when it stacks, and that's because it's actually sitting inside that grid cell that is only 10 VH. It has a hard height set on it, and the content's actually breaking outside of it. So we're gonna need to fix that because we don't want our headline to be in the in that top space. And we also, you can see we have this white space down here, and we're gonna want all of our image to take up all of these spots. So let's go ahead and fix our image first and make our image appear to be a background image on our promo space. To do that, we're actually going to specify two things. We're going to start by using named grid lines to create an area that we can put our image inside of. So in this case, we're going to come in, we're going to, in our rows, use square bracket syntax. This is how you actually name a line in CSS Grid. And we're going to say image-start, and at the very end, image-end. And so this is one of those few things in CSS where naming actually matters. What this is actually going to do is create a grid area called image that goes from image-start to image-end. This is syntactic sugar to make this a little bit easier on developers. If you name the lines without start and end, you can still make this work. It's just a little bit more typing to do in the long run. And then we can also define where we want the image area to be around the columns as well. And this is why we defined out this column so we could use these grid named lines. And we're going to do the same exact syntax with square brackets, image-start and image-end. When we go back over to our browser, nothing has changed. All we have done is defined what these lines are named. We have not actually gone in and created what content is going into those areas. So we're going to come back over and we're going to define out a promo __ image, which I'm going to double check to make sure that is our, yes, that is our CSS selector, our class up there. And I'm going to give it a grid area of image. And now you can see when we come over here, it's actually taking up 5 rows and is pushing all the other content outside of that. And that's because despite the fact that we've put it in this area, Grid out of the box doesn't want to do overlap. It does overlap very, very well, but you have to explicitly place things on the grid to create the overlap necessary. Now, we could go in and, like we've done in the previous exercises, define out on each of those items exactly which grid line numbers we want to take up. But instead of doing that, we're going to use a new property called grid template areas to define out areas that we're actually going to flow our content into. And this is going to allow for bigger changes later on. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to define out grid template areas. And I'm going to use this new syntax that actually takes into account the white space of what we're doing here. So we've got multiple quotation marks that are going to be our rows, and then inside of each of those rows, that's where we're going to define out our content. So first and foremost, we want a blank grid cell. We want that top grid cell to just be a margin. And so there's actually syntax built into the specification where any number of dots, any number of periods is going to allow that cell to have nothing inside of it. It actually still builds that cell, but means that we don't actually have to put anything inside of it. And then I'm going to line up our spaces here. I'm going to say the headline goes next, and then under that we've got text, and then under that we have button, and then under that we have another empty cell. And the naming of this doesn't matter at all as long as the named areas you create in this line up with the grid areas you define on the classes for the elements. So we're going to come down and we're going to move our headline down into the second grid cell. So I'm going to say promo underscore underscore headline has a grid area of headline. No quotation marks on this one because it's actually defined that as a string that it can find. So we're going to go back over and we're going to refresh. And not a whole lot has changed yet because we're still not having this overlap happen. It's still trying to find its way out of that. Let's go ahead and define out all the rest of our items. Promo headline, text gets a grid area of text, and promo button gets a grid area of button. Now it's all gone away. It's not completely gone. It's just behind our image. Our image is coming in on top of our content. And this is a very easy fix because the CSS specification authors, the working group, created the same functionality for z-index as we have with positioned elements as well. So if you know how to use z-index on positioned elements, you know exactly what to do here. And we're going to define each of these as having a z-index of 1. And that's going to bring it out on top of our image. You could define really any value here and it would get us where we need to be. And as you can see, now we have it up there on top. However, you can also see that our image is not spanning the full height of our area. And one of the things that images do is they have an intrinsic aspect ratio built into them. And unless we actually tell Grid to allow for this to stretch, it's automatically going to have a height of auto. So in this case, we're going to go in to our promo image, and we're going to use that same box alignment module that we used in the last exercise to say align self stretch. Refresh the page, and now we have a background image that is spanning the full height of this area. Now, you might also say that you can't read that text, and I would fully agree with you. So we're actually going to use a couple new properties to make this work, and they are not grid specific, but I think they're really interesting and allow for us to do some really cool stuff with grid. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to define a background color on our main promo area. Background color, and we'll make it a nice dark gray, 333. And we're also going to have our text color be white, so FFF. And then on our image, we're actually going to define a mix blend mode of, you could have multiply, you could have screen, you could have overlay, and this will actually allow for that background color to bleed through. That's a little bit too dark for my taste. We're going to go with overlay. I think that's going to be a little bit nicer. Come back in, and now as you can see, the image and the background color now blend together, and it makes things much more readable. Now, in our example, we did a couple other things as well. We had a little bit of margin space, and we also had text align center for our promo text. So I'm just going to define the text alignment on our top level, text align center, and this is going to affect all the text inside of our promo. And then we're going to define out margin for each of our headline text and button. But I'm going to go ahead and refactor this area to make it a little bit more concise, and I'm actually going to use comma separated values in my declaration to hoist all these values up into one declaration block instead of rewriting this code over and over again. We know that z-index is one thing that we need, so we'll go ahead and bring that in and delete it from everywhere else. Refactoring feels good. All right, now we're also going to apply a margin to each of these, 0 top and bottom, and we want, I don't know, maybe 1 rem's worth left and right. Let's go ahead and view that. And now we have a lovely amount of space for each of those promo items. So we can actually go ahead and expand that out. And as you can see, as we get bigger, we get more and more space in here, and we can allow for some different alignments to make that happen. However, we're not actually going to get that far because we want to, at a bigger screen size, shift into a different methodology. So let's go ahead and go into responsive view in Firefox, and we're going to go to an iPhone size. Let's say 678. That sounds good. And this is really what we're targeting for this promo style. But as we get bigger, we want it to adjust. And I think maybe a rotated iPhone 6 or 7 is actually where we want to start maybe breaking that onto a 2 across grid. And so we can do that easily enough. And again, since we're doing mobile first, we're still going to come in and define a media query. So we're going to say media. And inside of this, we're going to define our min width. So min dash width of 667 pixels. Now your breakpoints may vary. Whatever you're using for your breakpoints now is fine enough for me. But I grab that value by knowing what the landscape view of this iPhone 6, 7, 8 was. And that's going to be 667. So inside this, we're going to redeclare our promo. And actually, we don't even need to redeclare our promo. We're just going to work on that promos area. So right now, promos is just display block. It's just a column going down the page. For our promos area to work 2 across, we're going to define a grid. So our grid context is defined by display grid like we've done in the past. And then I'm going to define out a grid template columns for this of 1FR, 1FR. Again, creating 3 grid lines, 2 grid columns. Come back over here, refresh, and now we have those 2 promos side by side. And I think a nice little gap would really make a lot of sense here. So we're going to use that same value we used in the earlier exercises of grid gap of, I don't know, we'll call it 1 rem. That's probably good enough. Let's take a look. There we go. That's looking pretty nice. We got 2 promos side by side. So we have now defined a mobile view of 1 across with a nice background image and some text on top of it. We get up to landscape mobile. We will see 2 across. And then we get up to a desktop size, or maybe an iPad at landscape. We want to define out a new methodology, that full width container for each of these with the image broken out from its content. And so to do that, we're going to do one more breakpoint. We're going to define one. I'm going to choose 1024 as my breakpoint on this one. And we're going to come in and we're going to say at media min width 1024 pixels, not 25, 24 pixels. And we're going to define some new styles, and we're going to have to define new styles for both our promos and for our promo class. So I'm going to go ahead and define out promos. And I know I want these to be full width, but I want a little bit of margin left and right. So I'm going to go ahead and define out our width on this to be, I don't know, about 95 VW. And then I'm going to say our margin is going to be auto. So that's going to create perfectly even margins left and right with about 95% of our browser window. So as you can see, our width just got a little tighter, and that's all that changed there so far. So in order to get this onto each of these elements being stacked on top of each other again, we can do one of 2 things. We can go to our previous breakpoint, our 667 breakpoint, and put a max width on top. But I think that's a little bit verbose, and I like things to kind of stack a little bit better. So I can very easily come in and I can override the promos grid template columns to just be 1FR again. So we can say grid template columns 1FR, and that will take us back at this size to a promo area that's the full width of the space. As you can see, we go to 2, and then we get to a certain size, and we break back up to 1. So from here on in, we're going to go back to working on our promo class. And we're going to break out our elements without having to rework any of our HTML, which is great in terms of accessibility, content flow, all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to define out a new promo class. So dot promo. And then inside of that, I'm going to define out a new grid template column. So instead of doing just the 1FR, I'm going to say grid template columns, and it's going to be a 2-column layout. We've got that left column and the right column that we want things to go into. Save that in. We'll get a really weird looking thing here. It's all squished over on the left-hand side. The image, again, trying to keep its intrinsic width, is going to expand out to fill the space as much as it can, because FR is a fraction of the white space, not a fraction of the actual space itself. So the white space is actually shrunk by the image, and you can see the left-hand side is to actually define a width by this word headline at the second line up here, because that's as much room as it can fill there. So we're going to go back in and we're going to use grid template areas again, and we're going to overwrite our grid template areas from before to incorporate an image on the right-hand side and headline, text, and button on the left. So grid template areas again, and we're going to define again inside of quotation marks. And we know on the left-hand side, we want the top and the bottom to be white space. So we're going to do dots again. And like I said before, you can have as many periods as you want to define that white space. And then on the right-hand side of this, you want an image. We're going to go to the next line, line things up as best you can, and we're going to say headline and image. I like to keep things as lined up as possible in my code. It is by no means a requirement. You can put all these on one line and they'll work just fine. It's going to be much better for your head if you keep them aligned. And VS Code luckily keeps my cursor where I want it to be after I've defined where I want it to be. So it goes headline, then text. And again, next to text is an image. And just like the periods, you can use as many spaces as you want to create this area. So again, it's all about keeping things lined up to make the most mental sense for you. And then finally, we have button, and button's going to be next to the image, and another set of white space and image. So now, if we've done all of our previous steps properly, we should have to write no more code to get this spacing correct. Let's take a look. All right, that's looking close to where we were. Now we still have a background color, we still have that multiply happening, and we still have center aligned text on the left. So in order to do that, we're going to go ahead and bring those values back to maybe more default values. And that's why we started mobile first, because hopefully overriding these are a little bit easier in this direction. So our background color, instead of being a dark gray, we want that to go back to transparent. And then our color is going to go back to black, which would be default, or if you want it to be a nice dark gray, that'd be fine too. And then the text alignment is going to change from center back to left. You could use initial for a lot of these things or define them explicitly, however you're feeling on that. So we refresh the page, and now we have pretty much what we were looking for in our starting point. But we still have two right-aligned images. So we could go in and we could create a whole different layout for all this, but we could very easily, since in our HTML, we actually have a class of even applied to that second one. You could use nth child if that was your jam. We're going to come into our media query and we're going to define out .promo.even. And then we're going to just redefine our grid template areas again. I'm very happy on my A's today, apparently. All right. And then instead of having the image on the right-hand side, we're going to have the image on the left with the same kind of values on the right. So let's go ahead and define that out. Image, this is going to be headline, image, text. It's a little bit easier when the left-hand side doesn't have periods. Image and button, and then finally image and white space. So we save that in. One thing that always throws me, I never want to end this line with a semicolon. I always forget that the semicolon is even going to be a thing at the end because I'm not used to writing CSS in these kind of big blocks like that. Save that in, and now we have the image on the left-hand side. And that works out pretty nicely overall. We get something that looks pretty good. Let's go out of responsive view. There we go. Pretty good at this size. Now the spacing is a little bit off. And the spacing was a little bit off throughout. And we're going to use the box alignment module to take care of that as well. And we're going to do that at all the sizes. Because you can see that's not great. I want my headline to be a little closer to my text. Same for those bigger spaces as well. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to go to outside of my media queries because I want this to affect everything. I'm going to go to my promo headline. I'm going to use that same align self property that we've been using so much. Align self, and we're going to tell it to align self end. Come back over. That looks a little bit tighter. As we go to different sizes, it should remain pretty tight. That looks pretty good. And that looks pretty good. So now the only other thing would be this button, but I actually don't mind a little bit of white space in between there, just to kind of have a bigger call out. And you could even make that a more button style to take up that white space as well. You could have this description text be center aligned. There's a whole lot of things you can do once you understand the basic concepts. There's a lot of tweaking that can go into it. So that's it for exercise 5. I want you to kind of take a moment and think about all 5 exercises and how you can apply those going forward. In this exercise, you could very easily take any number of promotional spaces or any number of layouts and adjust the way they look just by using grid template areas. Grid template areas aren't just for using these big sweeping changes. You can also use them just to define out your regular grid. So any of what we did before, even those banner images from the last exercise, you could go back and refactor into grid template areas, and it may end up working out nicely for you in a very readable, clean, semantic set of CSS. So we're gonna end things in the next little bit to kind of do a review of everything we've covered. But that's it for exercise 5. Take a few minutes, play around with it, maybe try out some different layouts the grid template area would be good for, and then we'll see you in the closing remarks.